want to give you first a brief outline. I think the bio I can take very, very short. Thank you for your kind introduction. And I then want to go from the more general, the broader picture to the more specific one. So why do we need to reduce flights as a society? Why do we need to reduce emissions? Why do we need to reduce flights? And what does that mean for science and teaching, of course? I find the topic of responsibility really important, so I have a few slides on that. Emotions, because it really surprised me at the beginning how emotional that topic is. The flying less surveys and the toolbox, this is going more and more specific into academia, and I finish with the lessons learned and the conclusions. So I did that topic since 2016. You mentioned that I initiated and led ETH Zurich's flight reduction project. I was project lead for a German network until end of last year. And this year, I, together with a colleague from ETH, founded this non-profit ETH spin-off. ILO in German or ILO in English, whatever you like. So, the hard facts. I start with that. With the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015, we agreed to keep global warming below 1.5 to 2 degrees. And in 2022, these are figures, put them together for the toolbox in 2022. So the calculations are based on 2022 figures. But to make the point clear, it doesn't matter that nowadays we are even warmer than that. But in 2022, the global warming already was 1.2 degrees compared to pre-industrial times. And if you take that, the CO2 budget, if you want to stay within the 1.5 degree target, the CO2 budget would already be used up in 8 years, considering the figures in 2022, or in 25 years if you want to stay within the 2 degree budget. So both is not a lot of time. And according to the calculations, the world population can emit roughly 235 gigatons CO2 to remain within the 1.5 target. Or if you divide those total tons with the world population, each person only has roughly 30 tons of CO2 during their lifetime. And that's really not a lot. So if somebody uses more than 30 tons, and all of us, I think, will use more than 30 tons, somebody else has less available. So this is a matter of fairness and inequality. And I was really surprised about that figure of 30 tons. So what does it mean about flying? And I've put together a few distances and emissions. So this is Frankfurt Main Airport return flight, and I used atmosphere for the calculations. If you fly from Frankfurt to Heathrow, it's 0.36 tons already. Boston, 3.4, San Francisco, 6.6 tons. And if you fly to Sydney return, and that's economy, you already use up nearly half of the budget you have available for your lifetime. And that's just one flight to Sydney. What does it mean if you look at the development of air passengers? And this is a graphic between, and you see in the x-axis, world passenger population between 1945 and 2022. And on the y-axis, you see the number of passengers. And I want to concentrate on the, let's see that I don't switch that off, on this line here, the dark blue line. And you see a near exponential growth. So air passenger travel is really increasing massively over time. And what I find very interesting in this graph is there are always dips. Here is the oil crisis, here is the Gulf War, here is 9/11, you have the financial crisis. So the only reason why passenger travel has a dip is due to an external crisis and, of course, here Corona. But after all these crises, passenger numbers increase again. And I was wondering, if we looked at Corona, and I want to pose this question to you as well. During Corona, my impression was there were no flights at all. How far do you guess do you have to go back in time? Don't look at that too closely, just have a wild guess at the moment. How many years do you have to go back to have the same numbers of passengers as during Corona 2022? 1 or 2 years? Okay. Any other guesses? I was far off.
Maybe 20 years.
Okay. Any more guesses?
35.
35?
25.
25?
32.
Okay. Any more or? You were much closer than I was, because I thought we have to go back to the late 80s, early 90s, because really my impression was no planes, no flights. So it's not really such a long time that you have to go back to get the same number of passengers as during Corona. Now I go more into the topic of academic flights, and I want to list 5 reasons why I think that the reduction of air travel, not just academic, but I want to focus here on the academic one, is relevant. And the first reason is that researchers do fly a lot. And there is a study by Burrian from 2018 that they do fly significantly more than the average population. And we also know that flights contribute substantially to total emissions of academic institutions. And I show you one graph here. I put that together for the Flying Less Toolbox. I go into more detail about that. And you can see that flight emissions in comparison to total emissions of the academic institutions vary, but they are quite often around 50 to 60%. So that's massive, and that's actually the reason why I got into the topic at ETH Zurich. I was at the time responsible for the air travel, for the travel report, and I was really surprised that 60% of ETH's total emissions were due to flights, more or less. So there is a problem, and the question is, how is that at your institution? Do you know the figures? Do you have the figures? Is it significant? Is it a massive, or is it a very low number? The second reason why I think this is a relevant topic is that emissions are not equally distributed, and that few flyers are responsible for most emissions. And there is an interesting study by Wines and Donner from 2018 from the University of British Columbia. And they looked at flight emissions of 1,500 people at 8 departments, and they saw a large, very unequal distribution. They found out that about a third of the staff did not fly at all, and 80% of the emissions were caused by only 25% of flyers, and even more so 50% of the emissions by 8% of flyers. So there are a few people at the institution who do fly a lot. And the figures I've seen from other universities, it's very similar. So it's just a few people who fly a lot. And we looked at that at ETH Zurich, and Iselin Methaug put together the figures in 2021 in a report. And she showed that 1 professor causes as many emissions as 2 guests, 5 senior researchers, 8 PhDs, 25 administrative staff, and 84 students. So if you look at flights, and if you want to create a project, or if you want to tackle it, you need to ask yourself as well, do you want to reduce flights for everybody the same way, or do you want to tackle those who fly most? And it's a question you need to discuss within your organization. And this inequality of flight emissions is also a topic in further studies. One is Gössling and Humpe, for example, 2022. And there is a very nice graph here that air traffic is the most unequal mode of transport. It's from the Stay Grounded Network, who put together the information from this paper. And they showed in this paper that 1% of the world population, that's the little figure in yellow up there, causes 50% of commercial aviation. That's the half of the yellow planes. And that 80% of the world population did not fly at all. So again, this is a matter of really inequality. Another reason is fairness, and increased air travel has also increased inequality, which might come as a surprise in the beginning, but not everybody has the same opportunity to travel. There are visa requirements, so not every country, not every citizen can travel as much as they want to. There are remote regions, there are caretaking responsibilities, so it is a gender issue as well. From the data I've seen from some of the universities, women fly a lot less than men. So question is, would that be something interesting for gender gender responsibility people in an organization? And in particular, there is a large inequality because of finances, because some countries don't have the money, some organizations don't have the same finances. There are richer universities, there are poorer universities, and within a university there are groups which have more money, and within a group you have people who have the budget responsibility. That's probably why there is such an inequality between the status groups as well. So there is a matter of fairness or not fairness and inequality. And the fourth reason is leading by example and credibility. And there is a study by Attari that researchers lose public credibility if they do not follow their own advice. And the fifth reason is the argument I heard most: we need to fly to be scientifically successful. And there are 3 studies, one again from Wines, from the University of British Columbia from 2019, and they did not show, or they showed a very small impact between air travel and scientific success. There is another study about the number of citations, and there is a 3rd study on academic social capital, so beneficial academic relationships, and they didn't really see much of an impact. However, there was a study by Burney et al. In 2022, and they found a correlation between flights and age index, but they were not sure if there's also a causality. So they raised the question, is it that scientists who travel more obtain more scientific visibility and get more citations, collaborations, and papers, so that would be the exposure effect? Or is it instead that scientists who are more visible because of their work get to travel more, and that would be the reputation effect? So to summarize that, what does climate neutrality or net zero mean for science? And I want to ask a few questions. How do you do excellent science and teaching in the future under the conditions of net zero or climate neutrality? With almost no flights or with a massive reduction? What does this science and teaching look like in the future? And how are individual scientific activities and science organizations affected by that? And very important, how do you make the transition? Because it doesn't happen within a few days, and we don't have much time left. And most importantly, I think, who is responsible for initiating and steering this process? So the question of responsibility and accountability. And I have 2 slides on that. And I want to go through the top-down process of responsibility, and I want to use the example of flights. So society and politics, they do set targets, like the net zero target, for example, by 2030 or 2040, and they initiate laws. The management of the university or the research institution, they have to oblige by that, and they put in place travel guidelines, reduction targets, carbon budget, carbon tax, and so on. And that applies to the faculty, the department, and the institute, and they put that into a reduction target for smaller units and the concrete implementation for individuals, researchers, staff, and students. And they do the teaching and research according to the specifications. Now, the question of responsibility and accountability, so the control. So the leadership level has the responsibility to set the standards and rules, like I mentioned before, and to communicate those norms and rules, to create incentives and to ensure transparency. For example, with flight emissions, and the staff and the units, they have to adhere to the standards or rules. And the leadership level also have to hold the units accountable to monitor compliance, to acknowledge positive results, and also to act in case of non-compliance. And all of that, I think, is well put together in the statement by Beck in order to prevent organized irresponsibility. Institutions must be so designed that responsibility becomes clear and can be claimed. Which brings me to the second topic, which I find very important and which I completely underestimated, which is emotions. When I started with the topic in 2016, I knew that it's probably not the topic you would make yourself most popular in an organization, but I was really surprised how emotional that topic is. And I want to show both sides of the emotions. So on the left-hand side, you see the emotions if you do fly, and they can be positive emotions like pleasure, pride, relaxation, excitement. But there can also be negative emotions if you have to fly, like stress, loneliness, fatigue, or guilt. Now, what happens, and I think that happens with all of us, if you are not allowed to fly any longer, which you see on the right-hand side. If you like flying, there might now be disappointment, guilt, confusion, fear, sadness, and anger. But on the other hand, if you did not like to fly, and now you don't have to fly any longer, you might be very relieved. But I think all of us do have emotions about that topic. And what can be reactions? A typical and common reaction, and that's not just for flying, I think that's for a lot of climate issues, is to deny or to downplay the information that is too uncomfortable, like, but the printing paper is too much, or did you ever look at the canteen, or things like that. Or people can get angry, they question your agenda, they feel betrayed, or they snap at you. Should we all stop breathing? Something like that. So be aware of these emotional reactions. Now I come to the more specific topics about the Flying Less survey results, about academic air travel. And in 2022, we performed surveys at 8 academic institutions in Germany, and in 2023 at 10, to get a broader picture about that topic and to provide the organizations with facts and figures. And I want to pick out 3 topics here, which is travel reasons for scientists and students, and the associated environmental costs, the importance of the topic for scientists and students, and the approval of specific measures by scientists and students. And if you want to look into more detail, you can find the survey results online at the Flying Less webpage. So, travel reasons. Why do scientists fly? We asked them, or we gave them 10 different travel reasons, which you can see on the left-hand side. And we asked them which of those reasons, and each reason is depicted in one bar, and we asked them which reasons they find very important or rather important, which is in orange and blue, and I want to focus on those 2, and on the first 5 reasons. So conferences, including presentations or just for poster presentation, were by far most scientists considered that as very important, or rather important, 90%. Strategic collaborations were considered as very important or rather important, field research and meetings still with around 50%. And I think that's interesting if you want to think about measures. So where do you have a lever? Which fields are the most important one? And you probably wouldn't focus on committee meetings then, unless the figures in your organization are different. So that's why you need good data. And if we look into the emissions from conference travel and potential alternatives, there is a very nice paper from Klöver et al. From 2020. And they looked at the American Geophysical Union fall meeting in San Francisco, which is every December, and it's a huge meeting. They have 28,000 participants, and they estimated that this conference emits around 80,000 tons of CO2 equivalents, and 75% of flights are long-distance flights, over 8,000 kilometers. And to put that into perspective, maybe that's less helpful for you, but if somebody's from Germany, a medium-sized city like Constance, that's 2 months of the annual emissions. And what they did in this paper, and that's, I find the most interesting part, is they looked at different scenarios. So the light, so the greenish color is the emissions of the HGU in 2019, and then they played around. So they played around moving it to the center of the US. Instead of the West Coast, they moved it to the center, and they already saved around 12% of emissions. And then they did increasing virtual participation. They did biannual, they did 3 different hubs, and they did fully virtual. And you can see how many emissions they saved in the dark blue color. Travel reasons for students, we asked that as well. And absolutely, more than half of travel reasons for students were student exchange. And there is one paper by Davis and Dunk, it's already from 2016, but they showed, it's from the University of Cambridge, and they showed that student mobility does have a large footprint, between 1 to 3 tons of CO2 equivalent, which is quite a lot. And what's even more interesting, and that also applies to staff, it's not just the footprint of the students traveling, but it's also of people visiting them during their stay. So it's 2 to 3 times as many emissions if people go abroad. How important, we also asked them how important did they consider implementing flight reduction measures at the institution, and we asked scientists and students. On the top you see professors and group leaders, below scientists without professorship, and the lowest bar are students. And again, very important, rather important, are in orange and in blue. And you can see that around 60% considered that rather important or very important, which is a good sign. If you look at how important did students find avoiding air travel during their studies, so particularly for them, 70% of the students, 75% preferred not to travel by air. But if we think about the responsibility issue, 77% of students also reported that they can decide if they fly or not fly. So they do have something they can decide on their own. And we also asked them the importance of future employers' efforts to reduce flight emissions. And again, you can see in orange and dark blue, very important or rather important, and 74% of students preferred to work for an employer who aims to reduce flight emissions. So that might be interesting for future employers as well. Now, the last bit I want to point out here is the approval of specific measures, scientists and students, and the 3 colors are the 3 groups again, professors and group leaders on the top in this bluish color, scientists without professorship in dark blue, students in orange. And voluntary measures, not surprisingly, are the most popular measures. But even mandatory measures were considered by quite a lot of people as important. Clear responsibility was considered as very important. Financial and human resources for projects about flight reduction, higher quantitative reduction targets, penalties, they were very unpopular. So there were not many people who considered that as very important or rather important. And then there were none of the above. Now, how do you go about? We all know that we need to reduce flights, and there are a number of academic flight projects, but concrete guidance how to tackle that problem is missing. And that's the reason why in 2022 we developed an evidence-based and experience-based flying less toolbox to support all kinds of academic institutions and also the interesting scientists and students to design their own process and implement the necessary steps. And I have a few slides on this toolbox, and I first want to show a video, which is about 1 minute.
Many researchers have a dilemma. On the one hand, they want to be successful scientists and participate in international conferences. On the other hand, they are aware that air travel contributes to the increase of the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere and is thus partly responsible for climate change and its consequences. How can this dilemma be solved? How can science contribute to the net zero goal? In the Flying Less project, as a key element, we have developed the Flying Less Toolbox. It contains important information on the topic and a guide for research institutions to successfully reduce their flights. The toolbox is evidence-based and builds on many years of experience. It is an effective tool for implementing the Flying Less motto, successful research, less flying.
So this is the setup of the toolbox. It has 6 different modules. I like to show the video because I like the drawings of Lucia Fabiani so much. She made the drawing on the first slide, and I think they are really cool. So anyway, the toolbox has 6 different modules, and I want to focus on 2 modules here, on the checklist and on the module of measures. There is also a module on background information and supporting arguments with a very, very large set of slides on the relevance, and some of the information I showed here are from there, on framework conditions within the institutions and within society. What does it mean, sufficiency, travel reasons, success factors and stumbling blocks? This is basically the checklist with my personal input where I thought which can be difficult topics, psychological approaches, and then methods and tools. So, the checklist. When I designed the checklist, I thought, what kind of questions do I need to ask myself if I implement a project or start a project like at EGH again? So, there are all kinds of topics with questions associated with it. So it's the topic of governance, for example, it's operationalization, data, and so on. And if you go through that checklist and answer the questions, you know where your organization stands, and you do have an implementation plan. And after that, you know who needs to do what within what time. So that's the idea of the checklist. And the other module, I have 1 slide on its measures, and its measures at all different levels to show that all the different status groups and sectors are needed. So for example, the management level, they need to set up quantitative reduction targets. They can introduce a carbon budget, a carbon tax, travel guidelines, and so on. Administration, they need to implement a monitoring system, which is really important because you need good data. Information and tools like a travel decision tool, make progress on virtual and hybrid conferences. Research, they might consider the choice of cooperation partners according to geographical proximity instead of choosing always overseas cooperations. Bundle travel occasions, use virtual tools and so on. And for teaching, you need to consider sustainability in the curriculum. You might do local project excursions and travel by train, for example. And questions you need to ask yourself if you develop specific measures is, where are the levers for flight reduction? I mentioned that before. Where do most emissions occur? Which existing framework conditions could be changed in the short term? Which can you change in the medium term? What new measures need to be introduced? And how do you motivate the organization and the individuals to reduce their flights? And what incentives and disincentives are there? And do you differentiate the measures by status group, by situation, by frequent flyers, or do all measures apply to everybody the same? So these are questions you need to consider and to discuss within your organization. And also, if you have a quantitative reduction target, have you broken down that to available CO2 budgets? Have you broken down it to different organizational levels? So I think it's not enough just to have a quantitative reduction target for the organization, but you need to make it applicable to individuals as well. So you need to break it down to departments, to institutes, to groups, and to individuals. So everybody knows where do I stand, and what can I do to contribute to the reduction target and to the net zero target of the organization in the end. So the last two slides, it's first of all the lessons learned. I think it's really important to define and to implement responsibilities. I think from my experience, the top-down support is absolutely essential. You do need the top-down support. But this is also a topic where bottom-up decisions by individuals are taken. So you need to take individuals with you as well. It's an individual, an organizational, and a societal responsibility. And that's, I think, why I'm still intrigued by this topic, because you have all different levels. And there are not so many topics where the society, where the organization, and where the individual can do something and need to do something. So if you look at these responsibilities, you also need to consider what kind of framework conditions do we need to change. You need to address conflicting targets, and there are conflicting targets. For you, for example, it's really nice to be here, but there is an environmental price to pay for that. And I'm very curious about the questions and discussions about that. And if you address the conflicting targets, you also need to create socially acceptable alternatives. I think co-benefits is a very important term because it's not just the CO2 and the environmental costs. I think there are also economic and social aspects. I mentioned the gender issue, I mentioned fairness, things like that. You need a very good database. I think if you have no database, you can't talk about quantitative reduction targets, and you can't talk about net zero. Transparency, I think, is a really powerful tool. And of course, virtual tools are important if you want to reduce flights, and I believe in networks and joint initiatives. So to come to my conclusions, I strongly believe we do need a transformation. And this needs creativity and innovation. And academic institutions and you as the future leaders, they are creative and innovative. So you need to use this for this topic as well. I think that business as usual is not an option and that different framework conditions are needed. But be aware, change triggers emotional reactions, and it takes time to getting used to. And unfortunately, there is not much time left. So we need to rethink our current system, and a change in values and culture is needed. So with that, I'm very much looking forward to your questions and the discussion.